The Gospel according to St. Mark. Mark, also known as John Mark, grew up in Jerusalem. John is his name in Hebrew, Mark is his name in Greek. We know nothing about his early days. But as the early church began to grow, as we read about in the book of Acts, we find that his house, run by his mother Mary, was the center of worship center as well as prayer meetings. In Acts chapter 12, there's the account of Peter getting out of jail, and Peter goes directly to Mary's house upon getting out of jail, where there's a prayer meeting going on. Next, we hear of Mark being invited on a missionary journey with Paul and Barnabas. Barnabas, we're told in the New Testament, is the cousin of Mark. Mark returns early from that missionary journey, which causes Paul a lot of consternation. There begins to be a conflict between Paul and Barnabas over Mark, as Paul saw Mark being irresponsible and deserting them, but Barnabas wanting to give Mark another chance. There turns out to be a split between Paul and Barnabas. Paul takes Silas in one direction, Barnabas takes Mark in another direction. Later, Paul and Mark reconcile, and Paul's in Rome doing ministry. He invites Mark to come to be with him. But soon after Mark arrives in Rome, Paul's in prison where he spends the rest of his life. And so quite naturally, Mark gravitates to Peter, who was not in prison, who was free, very openly preaching. And for a good length of time, Mark is Peter's right-hand man. He's Peter's disciple. In 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 13, Peter greets the hearers of his letter and says Mark also greets them and calls Mark his son. Peter dies around 65 A.D. And at the death of Peter, there began to be a great need to have what Peter had taught and what he had preached to be written down. Mark was the obvious person to do it. Also at that time, there was the beginning of persecution against the Christians by Nero in Rome. And so the Christians needed a concrete text of the teachings of Jesus, of his life, death, and resurrection. And thus, most likely in Rome, Mark wrote his gospel. A Christian named by the name of Papias, about 60, 70 years later, wrote about Mark's writing of his gospel. And he said this: Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately whatever he remembered of the things said and done by the Lord, but not, however, in chronological order. For he neither heard the Lord nor accompanied him. But afterwards, as I said, he accompanied Peter. Therefore, Mark made no mistake in thus writing things as he remembered them. For of one thing he took special care, not to admit anything he heard, and not to put anything fictitious into the statements. Thus we have the gospel which bears his name, the gospel according to St. Mark. It's most likely the earliest of the four gospels. It certainly is the shortest. And it's where we will be spending the next 10 weeks here at Living Word, reading, listening, and responding.